But then 18 million people get social grants as part of the socialist system that we've gone in. Even though we would love to help poor people, it is simply not sustainable for 3 million people to pay 91% of the tax and then support 18 million people. And then also you have a situation that might have had a chance to work if you did not have this massive corruption.
Good morning, vereniging. My name is Donald and welcome to WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're talking with Kallie Kriel. Kallie is the CEO of Afriforum. Kallie, good morning and welcome to you.
Good morning to you, Donald, and it's a great pleasure to speak to you.
And so, Kallie, a lot of people know what Afriforum is, or they think they know what Afriforum is, but just for our viewers, just to clear the air, what is Afriforum?
Well, in short, we're a civil rights organization in South Africa. At the moment, we have 293,000 active members. At the rate we're growing at the moment, we'll reach 300,000 before the end of the year, which gives us the capacity to do a number of things. Fortunately, these members support us monthly. And of course, we know that you need, if you want to be a very effective civil society organization, you need to have support. Most of our members are members of the Afrikaner minority community in South Africa. But of course, what we've seen over the past few years is that many other people see that we are doing work that also benefits the broader society. So we also see people from other communities joining us. Thus, we are not afraid to take on issues that are of importance with regard to the Afrikaans language and Afrikaners. But many of the issues we take on has a broader impact. So if you're going to, for instance, have a look at our campaigns with regard to what we supported, especially in a society where we see on a party political level, but also in terms of the political elite, there's a lot of polarization. But fortunately, that is not the case on grassroots level. So we launched an initiative to, on a basis of mutual recognition and respect, to build relationships. So we've started with various cultural communities, the Zulu community, the Barolong community, and many others. And of course, also with Advocate Gerrie at our private prosecution unit, we see that people are so desperate with regard to the collapse of the criminal justice system in the country that we're seeing people from all walks of life coming to us for support. But if I can just give you our broad strategy, it's actually quite simple. We want to build a free, a safe and prosperous society here on the southern tip of Africa. And we have a two-pronged approach in this regard. In the first place, we are a pressure group where we fight and protect basic human and community rights. But the vast majority of our efforts go into the second part of what we are doing, and that is to build self-sufficient communities, to build self-sufficient institutions, and to build alternatives where the government is failing and where we need to step in. So if I just give a short focus on the first part of what we are doing, of course, if you are going to act as a pressure group, you will have to be able to make court cases in some instances. Some cases you will have an activist approach to make sure that you mobilize public pressure on government. But also, of course, we look at, for instance, getting international support to put pressure on the South African government. And there are many issues that we fight on. If I can just name a few, we know that corruption is a huge problem in the country, and that is something that we work hard on to fight. The deterioration of infrastructure and the collapse of municipal services the collapse actually of municipalities, where there's a cadre deployment, a lack of competence, and of course corruption. We fight for property rights, we fight for language rights, we fight for freedom of the press, we fight for the rule of law. But of course, if you're just going to put your future into a strategy to fight deterioration, then that's of course not sustainable. And that's why while we are continuing with these fights and protecting people's rights, we build alternatives. And if I can just give you a few examples, we, for instance, got in Advocate Gerrie, who's well known internationally for the Oscar Pistorius murder case, where he was the prosecutor. And we were able to get his whole team that prosecuted the former police commissioner successfully, Jackie Celebi, who was also the head of Interpol at the stage. And that whole team has now, over the past few years, joined Gerrie. So where the criminal justice system fails, we are able to independently take it on because our law allows for private prosecutions. We have more than 150 local branches across the country that do practical things, where many of the fights are on a so-called political level. People just say, well, if government's not going to do it, we are going to do it ourselves. And we work, for instance, on fixing roads by fixing potholes. We paint roads at schools. We put up stop signs that have been stolen. We look at the refuge dumps to make sure they're up to standard. We're also, with the government failing for the past few years to publish their green and blue drop reports with regard to water quality and sewerage. We have our own testing system and we bring out a report every year. Then very important is where government is failing with regard to making our communities safe. And of course, we still put pressure on them. We go to the international community with regard to farm murders to put pressure on the South African government. But of course, then we say, well, let's do it ourselves, of course, within the framework of the law. So at the moment, we have 164 farm and neighborhood watches across the country, where we then just take the future onto ourselves. And Afriforum, we're not alone in this, fortunately. We're part of the broader solidarity movement, who has many institutions that also all work on the same basis, is to build self-sufficiency, to build strong community institutions on various terrains. So for instance, we have a sister organization in the movement called Academia, which is a private Afrikaans university. So on the one hand, we fought hard to try and keep Afrikaans in the public universities. Sometimes with regard to UNISA, we were successful, but at the University of the Free State, for instance, we were not successful, also not at the University of Pretoria.
Just for clarity's sake, you only fight for Afrikaans in the universities, not the other languages?
No, of course, we support that. We say that mother tongue education, even at the tertiary level, is very helpful. If you look specifically at our schools at the moment, 80% of our schools are dysfunctional. But you're never going to fix that if you're going to try and teach hard concepts such as maths and science in a person's second or third language, which they are not fluent in. So if you look at the matric results, especially in the dysfunctional schools in townships and in rural areas, where Black children are taught in English, then you get a big fallout rate. More than half the children that start, for instance, in grade 1, never reach grade 12. But the same also applies to universities, where if people have to learn hard concepts, and there's this fallacy that because English is the international language, it would be good for you to be taught in English. And that is wrong. The fact is you need to be taught in your mother tongue to be able to to master those concepts. But then you are able to apply those concepts internationally in English or any other language that you learn. So if you look at Afrikaners in the past that made a huge impact, even internationally, they were taught in Afrikaans, but they were able to apply their skills in English. And the same would apply to Black communities. If you are going to have a situation where you get people highly skilled in their mother tongue, then they will be able to be successful in any other language. But of course, for us, it would be paternalistic to now and try and fight on behalf of the Zulu community for instance, mother tongue. But we support that. So in our case, our members are largely Afrikaans, and we have a mandate to fight for this. But we would be more than willing to support any other group to make sure that we have a truly multilingual society, which is not just an ideological concept. It is actually a concept to make sure that people are developed to their full potential. And that is why it's an important fight for us to fight. And if we don't win the fight, we just build our own university. The same we did with regard to artisan training. We see that the state's artisan training institutions, despite the fact that they don't offer Afrikaans, they have deteriorated vastly. And then we've set up Soltech, which is a private institution. But we have many other projects. There's the Helping Hand, which is a sister organization of ours that gives financial support for needy students that don't qualify for the government's racially driven processes of assistance. So that is in a nutshell. Well, it wasn't really a nutshell, but that's broadly what Afriforum is doing.
But yeah, it's impressive, and it makes complete sense to teach a person in his mother language. You can teach the person a second language, which is the international language. But I mean, it makes sense to stick to the mother language as the primary language. But just quickly, what happened to Gerrie and the case against Robert Mugabe's wife? Is that still ongoing?
Yes, that case is still ongoing. What we've done, we were able to get the government to go ahead with the prosecution in that regard. So as we speak now, there is a warrant for arrest. So if she loved coming to Sandton to do some shopping, at least what we were able to do is to make sure that they don't use the Zimbabwean taxpayers' money, what they plundered over many years, to come and shop in Sandton. There's also a process to get extradited, so that is on. But of course, with extradition, you need the support of the Zimbabwean government to cooperate. But the case against her is still alive. She cannot come to this country, which of course is at least a step in the right direction.
Okay, that's interesting. And so Afriforum has recently released a tax manifesto, and it seems to quack like a tax revolt, and it almost looks like a tax revolt, but it isn't a tax revolt. So what is this new tax manifesto that Afriforum has published?
Well, it's a first step in what we need to achieve, but we regard taxation and as part of a compact between citizens and government. We pay government tax money, and part of that compact is that they must use that money to make sure that we are safe, not just physically, but also that our property is safe. So that is the broad compact. But what we are seeing is that that compact is being broken. Well, it's actually not just broken, it's being demolished by the way things are happening. And this tax manifesto then flows from that need. You know, we've seen state capture in South Africa. If you look at the Zondo Commission, what we're seeing there is just the tip of the iceberg. The corruption is actually endemic in the country. If you look at municipalities, well, even if you just look at the PPEs with regard to COVID, there's even corruption. So there's no sphere of government where there is not any corruption. And of course, the money that is being stolen is paid by the taxpayers. So we don't want to be accomplices in this theft, so we need to do something in that regard. There's an estimate that the money lost due to corruption and specifically also state capture is with around 1 trillion rand, which is probably about $70 billion if you bring that into dollars. So it's huge amounts of money that are being stolen.
And that is only what we know, probably.
Yes, that is unfortunately so, because you don't have a very successful criminal justice system. Many of these things never come to the fore, and people just get away with it. Then a second thing, apart from the fact that money is being stolen, the government's main responsibility is to keep the citizens safe. And we see every year more than 20,000 people being killed in the country. You have the commissioner of police saying that, actually admitting that they are unable to stop this. You see the same government where the people that pay taxes, where their property rights are being threatened at the moment. The main thing is we have 3 million taxpayers in the country paid 91% of the income tax. That's out of more than 50 million people, 55 million people in the country. But then 18 million people get social grants as part of the socialist system that we've gone in. Even though we would love to help poor people, it is simply not sustainable for 3 million people to pay 91% of the tax and then support 18 million people. And then also you have a situation that might have had a chance to work if you did not have this massive corruption. So this tax manifesto flows from that to say, okay, we have to declare a dispute because we cannot just sit back. So what is this dispute about? In the first place, we say there should be a secretariat. Even though if government in the beginning doesn't recognize it, we will set it up composing of people that support this tax manifesto of ours. And it is to play a oversight role. We also press for tax federalism. What do I mean with that? If you have the centralist socialist system where all the money goes to the state coffer that is centralized, you make it much easier for corruption to happen. You put the money in the hands of incompetent people where it is misspent. So we would rather see a situation where money goes back more to grassroots level, where people that are closer to the ground can spend that. And later on, we can speak with regard to the whole issue of the Western Cape. But if you're looking at taxation, we've actually done a study now. We haven't launched it yet. We asked Russell Lamberti to do a study for us. What is the percentage of tax being paid by people in the Western Cape? And what percentage comes back to them? And what we are seeing is that centralism is working for corrupt people that want to steal, but it's not working for the normal people or the ordinary people on the street. And that's why we want tax federalism, if that makes sense. We also say, well, you cannot use our tax money and then you want to take our property with issues such as expropriation without compensation. We want government to stop funding failed state enterprises. We've seen huge amounts of money going into SAA, going into Denel. There's actually a vast list of these institutions that are not workable. We know the free market always works better, privatization works better. But if you're going to have government institutions, at least make sure that you don't appoint cadres that have political connections, but not the ability to make a success of it, and make sure the money is not being stolen. Then we also demand that the criminal justice system should prosecute people. And if you look at the vast amounts of money that is being stolen and how few people actually land up in jail, that actually enhances corruption, because if you think you're going to get away with it, unfortunately, it seems then you will steal. And then the next issue that we want is a tax rebate. Because especially the middle class at the moment has a double taxation. You pay the government to provide healthcare, to provide a police service, and to provide many other services. But because they fail to do their job, people now have to go to private security companies. You have to go to private hospitals, and even in some cases, private schools. So we would want to see a situation, if you have to spend money on private security, it's money that you should not have had to spend if government worked, and there should be tax rebates. So this is a first step to declare a dispute and to put pressure on government to get the act together.
But I mean, this is great. This is a great initiative. But I mean, the ANC has ignored so many good advice. Why would they do this? How does Afriforum plan to enforce this? Like, what is chapter 2 of this discussion?
Yeah, we are not naive about the fact to think, now we have these good proposals and government would some late at night read this and they would say, okay, no, this is actually great, let's do this. That would never happen. They will not implement it voluntarily. So there will have to be pressure put on them. And it's not because we at Afriforum just wake up in the mornings and say, how can we put pressure on government? The reason why we have to do it is because that is the way that the ideology of the ruling ANC works. If you go and sometimes I don't even want to speak about this, because if you say it, people that are not informed would believe this must be a conspiracy theorist that is speaking with terminology used during the Cold War. But people should just go and read the strategy and tactics documents of the ANC. It is published on their website. I know the previous website provider stopped their website at this stage, but I think it might be up and running again. But of course, they have financial problems, so we don't know if how long that will happen. But people should go and look there. And if you look in their documents, they always start off with the concept of the so-called balance of forces, which is a Cold War terminology. You will do what the balance of forces allows you. They would, for instance, write to say in the 1990s, early 1990s, and at the end of the 80s, when the communism collapsed and when the Berlin Wall fell, communism and socialism was discredited. And then they said they had to adapt their plans because of the balance of forces at that stage. Then they say, well, with the economic bubble, bank bubble, property bubble in 2008, they say capitalism was discredited and the balance of forces changed. And you would see that they've then gone to more socialist policies. So they always work with this balance of forces issue. So if we want to be successful, we will have to put pressure on them. And the pressure is already mounting. You are seeing many things happening that is out of government's control. You see tax evasion already. I think one of the best examples is the e-toll system that simply could not work because the vast majority of people said no, and this is enough. We're not going to pay for that. You see tax avoidance, and that is, of course, legal, that people can do that, is to just say, what can I do? How can I structure my personal finances and my business to pay as little tax as possible to government? So that is happening already. There's a tax delay that is also a strategy that can be used. to only pay when you really have to, and keep the money back as long as possible. And I think the biggest, which is actually already a tax revolt, is the whole issue of immigration. People, for instance, a person like Johan Rupert has emigrated as a taxpayer. So he is a person that could have brought huge income to this country, but simply because of this, people are taking their money elsewhere. So there is a lot of pressure, and I think we can use this pressure to say to government, you know, if you don't want this to turn into a full-scale tax revolt, we are willing to work with you, because, you know, we don't want to see the collapse of the country. You know, if this ship sinks, we will all sink with it. But you need to use these mechanisms to put pressure on government, because they will not do it voluntarily.
Just for interest's sake, Johan Rupert, how much money has he taken overseas? Do you know in terms of percentage-wise, or how much shareholding he has taken overseas?
No, I'm not up to speed with his personal finances. Even if I was, you know, the numbers there, I wouldn't be able to pronounce. I would sound like Jacob Zuma if I tried to read those numbers. But of course, we know many of his businesses are overseas already, but he's registered elsewhere as a taxpayer.
So he plays a sort of double game where he says South Africa is a great place and perhaps a great place to invest in, but at the same time, those companies he invests in are overseas. But so do you think it's inevitable that with the ANC's incompetence and mismanagement, that we will see a tax revolt in this country, like a proper tax revolt, if things don't change?
Yeah, I just want to come back to you on Rupert so that it doesn't sound as if I'm criticizing him. The fact is, you know, people have to, you have to look after your own personal finances. And that does not only apply to Johan Rupert, it applies to me, even if I don't have that much money. So of course, I would do the same as he does, to say we need to make sure that this country works. But in the end, if I have to provide for my family, then of course I will see where would my money be safe. And that is why lots of money is going out of the country. If I had lots of money, I would have done the same, not because you're disloyal to the country, but you cannot simply just put all your eggs in a basket where the person or party carrying that basket, you know, will drop it at some stage. So in that sense, I have sympathy for that. So I don't want to criticize him, not because, of course, I'm scared, but because I think that one should just be fair in that regard.
Sorry, I also agree. Perhaps I was just a bit too aggressive there. Yeah, I also completely agree with that statement.
Yes, you then back to the question, will it flow over to a full-scale tax revolt? I think people are angry. I understand their anger. I'm also angry. The only thing preventing it from going into a full-scale tax revolt is the practicality of it. You know, in terms of Afriforum, it would be a very popular thing to say, let's just move into a tax revolt. And our members would love that. I would even love that. But if you want to do things with credibility, you must take on issues where you can be successful and not create false hope. And the problem we have at the moment is that the many working class people work for large companies. Their tax is being deducted by those large companies and paid over to government. And I can't foresee that big business would now say, well, we are going to stop paying over the taxation that we deduct from our employees over to government. But you are already seeing those companies do participate in a tax revolt, but they'll never do it in the sense that we are speaking of. They do it by taking their money elsewhere, which is a huge problem. And of course, a tax revolt would be nice to put pressure onto government, but we must remember it would also have the same kind of effect on ordinary people. And it's the same debate that was during the previous dispensation. Should there be sanctions? Of course, sanctions put pressure on governments, but of course, in the end, it also has a negative effect on ordinary people on the street. And in that sense, I just think we need to be careful, but without being soft. Something needs to be done, and we need to do what is practically possible.
And okay, so you're saying that it's unlikely that companies will stop paying tax, but what is the limit of what you see this potential tax revolt rising to? What tax is the most vulnerable that we'll see people will stop paying?
Well, if you will start seeing more people doing cash transactions, not through bank accounts. You will see it being done with Bitcoin and all other kinds of currencies, which in the end would VAT, value-added tax, will be lost. And I think there must be huge amounts of value-added tax being lost already. But people are not immoral. I think people have a conscience. So for a person would say, and also in terms of religion is, you must pay to the, I can't remember what is the Kaiser in English, but you must pay what is due. Yeah, you should pay what is, you should pay what is due to the Kaiser. So, but now people start thinking, is this money due to them? And I think it's not necessarily any more issue of people think it's immoral. People start to think more, well, these people are stealing, they're stealing the money, and I don't want to be part of it. So I think you're seeing a tax revolt already, but the unofficial tax revolt that is not people saying openly, I'm not going to do it. And of course, I mentioned tax avoidance. And so there are many places where you'll start seeing people only pay where they have no other choice.
If we can pivot to a province that I live in, the Western Cape, what is Afriforum and Kallie Kriel's opinion on Cape secession and Cape independence?
Yes, well, I can say what Afriforums is because we had a congress of our local branches in Knysna in November last year, where our branches unanimously said that we want growing autonomy. And again, we took that concept to our board. We also approved it. We went back with a plan that we'll launch later, where we spoke only 2 weeks ago again with our structures in the Western Cape. But officially, we are working for growing autonomy. And again, it's like a tax revolt. What is something that would be nice to have, but what is now at the moment practically possible is not always the same. And if you're going to start, if you want to win a race, you have to start at the start and not look at the finish necessarily, because there's a few hurdles you'll have to overcome in the process. And of course, there are differences. There are many people, good people that support total independence, and there's good arguments for that argument. So, but there are also others that say, well, we just want more power. I think it's good that you have people like the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, that you have people like Cape Exit, the Cape Independence Party. It's good that you have those groups to push for that. Afriforum's strategy has always been to try and focus on those issues where people agree upon and to mobilize as much support. So our stance is now to say, okay, we need to make sure that there's, in the first place, tax federalism, Because what is happening now, the Western Cape just receives the allocated amount from the national government. Population numbers are being used to work out that what funds will be paid over. But of course, you also have a socialist government leaning towards the poorer provinces. So that also plays a role in terms of who gets what money. And then the Western Cape just gets an amount, and they can do with that money as they please, but they cannot change the amount they receive. So what, for instance, happens at the moment, if you look specifically at safety and policing, there should be 25,000 police officers in the Western Cape. 5,000 of those positions are vacant. When people left, it was not filled. So now there's only 20,000 police officers. But now the Western Cape has to try and do something. So you see the Premier now has this leap, what they call leap officers, to try and fill the gap where the police can't be there because they have 5,000 positions short. So now they use gaps in the legislation where a Metro Council can have a Metro Police, and they have now appointed 1,000 so-called leap officers. But that costs them more or less R1 billion a year to run that. And that is what it costs. You don't simply just pay a salary. You need vehicles, you need office space, you need equipment. So it's a huge amount of money. But because they are now filling the gap that is left by the national budget, because the national department receives money for the police, now they have to use 1 billion of the money they receive. And they don't get more money because they are doing the job that the national government should have done. So they have to now cut elsewhere. So where are you going to cut? Are you going to take away from education? Are you going to take away from health? So that is a challenge. So our campaign is to say that there should be growing autonomy, and the Western Cape, let me just give 8 examples. They should get the tax that is being paid there, with a small portion going for things that national governments do or should do. And that is international relations and maybe the army, but of course, defense force. But that is also something the province can do. But you might make an argument in a good federal system, those are the 2 things that national governments, that's their competency. But then if you can get the tax for the other things, such as policing, energy, I think is very important, because the Western Cape is also being hit by Eskom's implosion with regard to the power supply that is not good. There are things that can be done in that regard with the new regulations, where municipalities has the possibility to make sure that they can create their own power. There's, with regard to public transport, you're seeing deterioration. We saw an uproar over the last few months with regard to public transportation, water, education, health, and fisheries. You know, we have close ties to many people working in the fishing industry in the Western Cape, local communities on the West Coast, where fishing quotas is being given by a national government that is sitting in Pretoria, and you know, that gives fishing quotas to people that are not really fishers, fishermen or women. They are people that have political connections. So those are the kind of things that I think we should focus upon now. Then, of course, we need to go into a situation where we can have a referendum on these issues. You know, a referendum will not be binding on the national government, but of course, you know, we always take the attitude, if you in the 1970s spoke to an ANC member that was part of the struggle, and he said, do you think the national government would go into a system of one man, one vote. They would have said no, it would never happen. But it did not stop people from building support, building international support, building local support to put pressure on the government. So a referendum would be very efficient in the sense that it will provide a moral high ground for this growing independence or growing autonomy that we are working for. We know that the current legislation comes from 1983 with regard to referendums. In 1983, that act was used for a tri-chamber parliament, if you remember that, and of course also in 1992. But that legislation only allows for the president of the country to call a referendum, while the Constitution allows the president as well as premiers to call a referendum. So that is one of the issues that we are going to focus upon. I know that the DA has started a parliamentary process to try and change that 1983 legislation to allow for premiers. But again, the ANC will oppose that. So we are preparing, but we haven't made it public. But I presume if I mention it now, it will be in the public domain. But we want to take the 1983 Act to the Constitutional Court to ask the Constitutional Court to give an instruction that Parliament should change it to be in line with the Constitution. And that the Constitutional Court has done before. You know, they looked at the legislation and said, this is not in line with the Constitution. And then they say, for instance, we give Parliament 12 months to change it. So that is the route we are going. I think that is also important to say, why do we need civil society organizations and not just let political parties do this? And I think you need both. You need political parties to work in the legislatures to try and change what they can. And I think in the Western Cape, there are, you know, if you look at the DA, if you look at the Freedom Front, if even the ACDP are parties that I think can play a constructive role. But we need also to have another approach to say, let's mobilize societies and let's mobilize people outside of party politics. And that is the role that Afriforum would want to play with regard to growing autonomy. It wouldn't matter for which political party you vote. If you say it is not right that Bheki Cele comes with his big hat onto Western Cape beaches and he intimidates women in bikinis with the big guns that the people with him has on the beaches, is that right? No, that's not right. He should not be there. Policing of the Western Cape should be in the hands of the people of the Western Cape. So that is the stance we are taking. We want to build good relations with those that want to go for full independence. We believe that our actions will also benefit them, but we also want to accommodate those that say we just need more federal powers. And if you can focus on what can be done now, and you start the snowball effect, nobody knows where it will end.
So, okay, if I understand you correctly, Afriforum is in favor of more autonomy for the provinces, and they are in favor of a practical route. And if it ends up with Cape secession, that is where it ends up.
Well, we won't stop it, of course, if it gets there. But what I've seen, unfortunately, you need a majority support for what you want to do in the Western Cape. And because I think people don't understand all these concepts necessarily, and it's not a problem, people are not all political scientists. They live a life where practicalities are important to them. What is happening every day? What are the bread and butter issues? And I think what we want to do is to say, to take this concept of growing autonomy and to say how it impacts on bread and butter issues. If the train doesn't work, or it is allowed that the train is being burnt down, because the taxi industry wants the routes or whatever. And you don't have the Western Cape government being able to address it because it is either a shared competency or it's either just a national competency. You have to say to people, you know what, if you want a working public transport system, then you need to support growing autonomy. And you can look at all these issues. If you don't want power cuts every now and then, and you want electricity to work, and you don't want corruption in the process, then you need to support growing autonomy with regard to electricity. And I think if we translate these issues into bread and butter issues, you will be able to show people that is what they want. You know, if you, I once read that Henry Ford, when they asked him when he built the car, or he actually had this mass production that made cars affordable. Then they asked him, did you beforehand do some market research? And he said, no, if I did that, people would have wanted faster horses. And I think that is, this is something that would be to the benefit of the people, but you would have to show that, and you would have to show that practically. And I think the best way to get mass support is to take this on at the practical level. Of course, it does not mean that that we are saying the Cape Independence Advocacy Group is wrong. You know, I've met some of their people, highly intelligent people that I think they are doing good work. But this is a case of horses for causes. You need those groups to do that. But Afriforum's role is always that of a grassroots level, practical organization. And I think if we say, you know, the problem is always if people have a disagreement on issues, they focus so much on those disagreements that they do not focus on those that they agree upon. And I think it can be mutually beneficial if we have a good working relationship and people respect the role that each organization has to play. But we will be making our plans known. We've had a lot of discussions with various people in the Western Cape. As I've mentioned previously, we believe that there should be, on a basis of mutual recognition and respect, there should be cooperation between communities on issues that are of mutual benefit. So Afriforum, as an inclusive Afrikaner organization, even though we have many colored people that are very loyal members of ours, Afriforum would not necessarily be the vehicle to mobilize all communities. You know, if somebody in Constantia listens to me now and they say, you know, this guy speaks with a very, very strong Afrikaans accent, they might not necessarily see me as a person that should play a good role. So we are also looking at setting up a new vehicle that represents various communities to make sure that that the growing autonomy for the Cape is a Cape issue and not an Afrikaner issue, not an English issue, not a white issue, not a colored issue. So that is the strategy, but I cannot say more, but we are working very hard on that at the moment.
And well, that's fascinating, and I can completely respect your position. But if we can pivot this once more to, obviously Afriforum represents Afrikaners, and obviously a lot of Afrikaners are farmers. I mean, I have a few family members who are farmers, and farm murders are obviously a problem in South Africa. Just to give our viewers and to our viewers an idea of how bad a problem farm murders is, can you give us some examples, some stories to tell of how bad farm murders are in South Africa?
Yeah, the problem that we have is that those people, well, let's just call them what they are, farm murder denialists. They would now work and say, you know what, there's such a huge crime problem, and this is just part of the broader crime problem in the country. But what people don't do is, if you're going to look at the murder rates in a specific community, for instance, the farming community, you cannot take it as a percentage of the total murder rate in the country. You have to take the number of farmers that there are, how many people are on farms, and how many of them are being murdered. And then you work out proportionally what is the murder rate. So if you do that, and there's a lot of disputes, you know, people will say, but okay, how many farmers are there? So I don't think anybody can have a sound figure, but you can have a educated and well thought through estimate in this regard. So what I can say is that your chances of being murdered if you're on a farm is twice as high as that of if you're a policeman or a policewoman, and between 3 or 4 times as high than an ordinary citizen.
Wow.
So, but you can also work that out for other communities. For instance, if you're going to say, well, gang violence, the murder rate with regard to gang violence is also much higher than the normal murder rate. Well, you cannot call a murder rate normal, but the average murder rate in the country. So you have these places or on certain issues where there's a real problem that needs to be addressed. So it's a real problem, but of course, if you go and look further, it's not just, well, I can't also just say a normal murder, but you see people are being tortured, and you seeing people murdered for no reason at all. You know, there was just 2 weeks ago on a farm here in the north, a lady that was 94 years old. She was shot and killed through a window. And you can say, well, this is not crime. This is actually a disrespect for life that you are seeing. So it is a huge problem. It has a huge impact on the farming community, because people can't just focus on what they do best, and that is to make sure that food is produced to give to the country. So those are the problems. And then furthermore, while you are struggling to do that, your life is at risk. Then you have politicians that make you the scapegoat for many things that go wrong in the country. You know, they say, no, you are land thieves, or you are racists, and you unfortunately also have a large portion of the media playing a huge role. You know, my colleague Ernst Roots, he, with his research people, did some time ago research with regard to what happened in Kulini. And you'll remember those 2 young farm managers that had a boy in the back of the bakkie. He jumped off. They wanted to take him to the police for sunflower theft. A tragic incident where the boy died. And immediately you had an eyewitness that later acknowledged, not to the court, but to other people, that he lied. And they were put in jail. And we had to, in the end, because we're not going to support farmers that makes themselves guilty of human rights violations. But the fallacy that farmers do that is being created by disproportionate coverage. In that year, that Kulini incident got more media coverage than all farm killings in that year put together. So, and in the end, these 2 people were found not guilty by the appeals court in Bloemfontein. So that is the kind of pressure that are on farmers. They're being portrayed as something that they are not. They are good people that want to play a positive role in this country, but are being targeted, if not by criminals that want to murder them, also it's by politicians trying to portray them as racist. And you have the media simply playing along with this narrative that is totally incorrect.
Mm. And how would we solve this problem of farm murders? Does it tie back to your previous point of decentralizing, like, for example, the police force?
Yeah. No, most definitely. It must be decentralized. The money must go where it is needed. Many of these police stations don't, if they have a vehicle, sometimes it's broken, sometimes there's no fuel. So there's a total lack of capacity with regard to the police. And in many cases, we work together with the police in a lot of cases. And I can tell you, the perception of the police is rightfully a very negative perception. But there are many people working in the police that really want to try and make a difference. And that those are people from all communities that want to do that. So we need to try and strengthen their hands. And the way to do that is to say, well, let's play our role. And it is completely possible within the framework of the law to set up community safety structures, such as farm neighborhood watches and farm watches. And what we've done is to say, okay, we don't have the manpower or woman power to be everywhere. So let's try and use technology. And what has started working very well for us is for instance, drone technology. We are busy registering a drone training academy. But at the moment, we're using other service providers where we have trained 63 drone pilots already. That's still not enough. And then our local structures buy drones. And these play a huge role, of course, especially if you have night sight equipment where you can spot people at night. And what that has also done is that there's bigger cooperation between ourselves and the police, because they don't have drones in large numbers. So we work with them where we can provide information that we get through drones. We set up a screen, and the police can also take part in that. Cameras, that is, I think, one of the big things. Unfortunately, it's not just Afriforum involved in this. If Afriforum, there's too much work for just one organization. So you have other groupings that do it. You have agricultural organizations that do it. You have normal neighborhood watches that is not part of Afriforum structures that are doing this, which is great. We should use these cameras, but what in the end is necessary is to make sure that at least these groups, even if they are part of different organizations, are willing to cooperate and set up, for instance, communication centers, monitoring centers, where we support one another. So I think there's good progress in that regard, but of course it's still not nearly enough. But I think the solution, on the one hand, we will have to take on these terrible perceptions that are being created. But on the other hand, it's again the fight and build, as I've mentioned in the beginning. But we have to build our own structures. We have to make them stronger. And in the end, I think that will be the only way that we will make a big impact against crime.
Well, thank you, Kallie. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I don't want to take up any more of your valuable time. So I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything, or answer a question you hoped that I would ask you.
No, I think what is important for me is that people remain hopeful with regard to the future. And that is, of course, quite hard because, people watch television, they look at the social media. So we should not be denialists with regard to what is going wrong in the country. You cannot provide hope by saying, no, it's not true. The way you can provide hope is to tell people, listen, there are serious problems. But what gives me hope, more hope than I had 20 years ago, is that if we take our future into our own hands and not look at government to build a future for us, then you become free, because then you say, well, we have a lot of knowledge in our communities, we have energy in our communities, we have the ability to take our future into our own hands. And then, of course, it's terrible to look at the Zondo Commission and see how money is being stolen, and it makes you angry. But if you realize that self-sufficient federal communities can take their future into their own hands. And the nice thing about this, people many times say, the ANC will never say yes for these plans that you have. They won't say yes, but we're not even going to ask them. The fact is, we don't have to ask permission if we act within the framework of the law, and we simply say we are going to create the future ourselves, for ourselves, for our families, for our communities. And if you do that, there's a lot to be hopeful about, because 20 years ago, things in the country was not as bad as now. But I think many people realized if you have a centralist socialist government, in the end, things will collapse. So 20 years ago, we knew this was coming, but we had nothing in place. And now that what is happening, that we foresaw is happening, at least now that we have our structures in place, they're not as strong as they should be. But we also saw with the unrest that was in KwaZulu-Natal, that was terrible, and a lot of people lose hope with regard to that. I also think it was terrible. But the one thing that gave me hope there was to say that there are many good people in all communities, and you saw them protecting the shopping centers in their communities. So we are stronger than we think we are. There are many good people in those communities that in the end will be on the side of what is good. And of course, the bad of our society will always be there. But I think we are strong enough to build a great future, not because of government, but despite this government.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you're going to stay in South Africa, be part of the solution and not the problem. I mean, there's probably more that unites us than divides us. But thank you so much, Kallie. Thank you so much for your time. To our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and this has been WorldView.